low, rhythmic thunder that was not in the sky. It was in the earth, a vibration that crawled up the soles of the feet and settled deep in the bones. Hoofbeats, too many to count, too heavy for merchants' horses. Kalia's hands stilled over the herbs she was sorting, her breath caught. Outside her small cottage, the birds fell silent. The wind itself seemed to hold its peace, waiting. Then came the scent. Ozone and cold iron, the smell of a storm that carried no rain, only wrath. It was the scent of power. Of a predator so great, the very air bowed before him. She knew that scent from whispers and nightmares. The Alpha King had come to their small, forgotten village, and he was hunting for a ghost. She moved to the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He was there, in the center of the village square, astride a warhorse black as a starless night. King Darius Velkin. He was more myth than man, a figure carved from grief and fury. A jagged scar sliced through one eyebrow, giving his face a permanent snarl. He was larger than the stories told, his presence a physical weight that pressed down on the world, making it harder to breathe. Behind him sat his guard, the Black Wolves, silent, masked wraiths whose only purpose was their alpha's will. The village elders were already on their knees. Kalia's blood ran cold. Rowan. She scanned the square, her gaze darting between the bowing villagers. He wasn't there. Thank the moon, she'd told him to stay deep in the woods today, to check the snares near the Whisperwood Creek. Far from here, far from this. The king dismounted. The motion was fluid, dangerous. The heavy leather of his riding coat creaked, the only sound in the suffocating silence. He did not look at the elders. His gaze, colder than the mountain ice, swept over the terrified faces of the crowd. He was searching, scenting. His eyes passed over her. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. It was not a look. It was an invasion. A raw, primal assessment that stripped away skin and bone and saw the trembling soul beneath. She felt an instinct she hadn't felt in years. The urge to drop her head, to show her throat, to make herself small and unassuming, to disappear. She forced herself to stand still, to look away, to become just another villager in a worn, homespun dress, just another nobody. His gaze moved on. The air rushed back into her lungs, painful and sharp. "I am searching for something stolen," the king's voice rumbled. It was not loud, but it filled every space, every crack in the silence. It was the sound of gravel and winter, and a throat raw from howling at a dead moon. A child, lost a decade ago, in the fires that took the Silver Moon pack. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The Silver Moon Massacre. A story told in hushed, frightened tones. A night of blood and fire when the king's mate, his Luna, and his entire pack had been slaughtered. They said the king had lost his soul that night, that he'd been chasing ghosts ever since. Kalia's knuckles were white where she gripped the windowsill, blood and rain. The memory hit her like a physical blow. The smell of it, the sight of the smoldering ruins of the Silver Moon camp, a place she had stumbled upon days later, scavenging for salvageable timber. And among the blackened stones, a sound. A faint, desperate whimper. She had found him there. A tiny wolf cub, his silver fur matted with his mother's blood, shivering beside her cold body. His eyes, even then, were impossibly bright, ancient and aware. The pure, unmistakable silver of the Velkin royal line. Taking him had not been a choice. It was an instinct deeper than reason. She had bundled him in her cloak, her own scent masking his, and had run. She had raised him in secret. This wild, silent boy she named Rowan, her boy. A boy with the king's eyes. He would be a youth now, Darius continued, his voice devoid of all warmth. On the cusp of manhood. He may not know who he is. He may not even speak. Kalia's heart faltered. Rowan never spoke, not with his voice. He spoke with his hands, with his eyes, with the quiet way he moved through the forest like a native shadow. The king's gaze narrowed, his nostrils flaring slightly. He was tasting the air, sifting through the scents of wood smoke and baking bread and fear. "My air carries the scent of winter pine and wild moonbloom," he stated, the words a direct challenge. "The scent of my line. Of my lost mate." Kalia felt her blood turn to ice. Moonbloom, a flower that only grew on her small plot of land, that she tucked into Rowan's pillow at night to soothe his restless sleep. She had scented her boy, her secret, with the very thing the king was hunting for. His guards began to move. They fanned out, their movements economical and predatory. They weren't searching with their eyes. They were searching with their noses, their heads tilted, their senses attuned to something no one else could perceive. Kalia backed away from the window. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. She had to get to him, to warn him, to hide him deeper in the woods where no one could ever find him. She turned, her mind a whirlwind of impossible plans, and her eyes landed on the small wooden wolf Rowan had carved for her. It sat on the mantel, its head tilted in a perfect imitation of his own curious expression. She had built a life on a secret. Now the secret was about to burn it all down. She had to run, now, out the back, into the trees, find Rowan and just vanish. Her hand was on the latch of the back door when a sudden commotion from the square made her freeze. A child's voice, high and clear. "The quiet boy," a little girl said, pointing. Her mother tried to shush her, her face pale with terror, but it was too late. Every head turned. The king's head turned. The child was pointing not at the crowd, but past it, toward the edge of the village, toward the winding dirt path that led to a single, isolated cottage nestled against the forest's edge. Her cottage. "He lives there," the girl whispered into the dreadful silence. "With Kalia, he doesn't play. He just watches the trees." The world stilled. The obsidian gaze of the Alpha King swung from the pointing child and locked directly onto Kalia's window. He couldn't see her. He couldn't possibly see her through the thick, warped glass. But he did. She felt it. A connection so sharp, so absolute. It was as if he had reached through stone and wood to grip her very soul. He started walking, not running, not rushing. A slow, deliberate pace that was more terrifying than any charge. His black wolves fell in behind him, a phalanx of shadows. The villagers parted before them like water before a shark. Kalia couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the floorboards. Run, her mind screamed it. Run, but her body wouldn't obey. She could only watch as he grew closer, each heavy footstep a hammer blow against her heart. Crunch, 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 the sound of his boots on the gravel path. He was going to find him. He was going to take him. And what would he do to her? The woman who had hidden his heir for 10 years. The woman who had raised the future Alpha King like a common stray. He reached her gate, a flimsy thing of woven branches. He didn't open it. He simply looked at it, and the wood seemed to groan under the weight of his presence. He stepped over it. He stopped in her small garden, his massive frame eclipsing the sun. He was so close now she could see the flecks of gray at his temples, the exhaustion etched in the lines around his mouth. This was not just a king. This was a grieving father, a male who had spent a decade hunting the last piece of his heart. He lifted his head and breathed in. Just once. A deep, slow inhalation. His entire body went rigid. The air around him crackled with contained power. His eyes, which had been frozen pools of ice, suddenly blazed with a fire that seemed to consume all the air. He knew. He smelled the moonbloom. He smelled the faint, lingering scent of the boy who slept here every night. He smelled the blood of his blood. He raised his eyes and met hers through the window. The accusation, the fury, the shattered, broken hope. It was all there. It pinned her, crucified her against the wall of her own home. And then a sound from behind her. A soft creak. The front door, which she had left slightly ajar, swung slowly open. Rowan stood there. He must have circled back, must have felt the shift in the air, the wrongness of it all. He stood on the threshold, framed by the dark interior of the cottage. He was no longer a boy, not quite a man, tall and lean, with a wildness that clung to him like the forest moss. His dark hair was unruly, his feet were bare. He held a half-carved bird in one hand, his knife in the other. He did not look afraid. He looked curious, confused. His gaze drifted past the dark guards, past Kalia, and settled on the king. For a long moment, everything was still. The king stared at the boy. The boy stared back. Darius saw the impossible. The ghost of his Luna's face, the high cheekbones, the proud line of her jaw, the defiant set of her chin. It was all there, living and breathing in the boy standing before him. And then Rowan lifted his head slightly, and the dappled sunlight caught his eyes. Silver. Pure, brilliant, undeniable silver. The mark of the Velkin Alpha. A sound tore from the king's throat. A raw, guttural noise of agony and disbelief. It was the sound of a wound, a decade old, being ripped open. He took one staggering step forward. Then another. He never took his eyes off the boy, but his final, terrifying gaze landed on Kalia, on the woman standing frozen in the window, the kidnapper, the liar, the keeper of his stolen heart. The king had found his ghost, and he looked at her as if she were the one who had dug the grave. Time shattered. The moment stretched, thin and brittle, until it was nothing but the space between two heartbeats. One, the king's, a low, predatory drum. The other, Kalia's, a frantic bird, beating itself bloody against the cage of her ribs. Darius Velkin did not move. He only stared. His gaze was a physical force, pinning her, dissecting her. The initial shock in his eyes had already cooled, hardening into something far more dangerous. A glacial fury, a cold, possessive certainty that promised retribution. He saw her, the thief, the woman who had stolen 10 years of his son's life, 10 years of his own. Behind her, she felt a shift. Rowan took a half-step forward, his bare feet silent on the floorboards. He was a breath away from her now, a warm, solid presence at her back. He did not understand the king's words, but he understood the threat. His scent sharpened, the wild pine of the forest deepening, a low warning to the storm that stood in their garden. The king's gaze flickered to Rowan. A muscle feathered in his jaw. His son, his living, breathing son, was preparing to defend this woman, from him. The father he did not know, the wound in his soul bled afresh. "Step aside, boy," Darius commanded. The words were quiet, yet they cracked like a whip in the heavy air. Rowan did not move. He only tilted his head, his silver eyes narrowed, a perfect mirror of the Alpha's own assessing stare. He held the half-carved bird in one hand, like a stone, ready to be thrown, a useless gesture, a fatal one. "Rowan, no," Kalia whispered, the word a dry rasp in her throat. She put a hand on his arm, a desperate plea for him to stand down. His muscles were rigid, coiled with a tension she had never felt in him before. Her touch, her whisper, broke the spell. The king's focus snapped back to her. The look in his eyes was no longer just fury. It was something deeper, a dark, possessive curiosity. He had lost his son to a massacre. He had found him being protected by a village, nobody who spoke his name as if it were a prayer. He began to walk toward the cottage. Each step was a judgment. The earth seemed to groan under his boots. The black wolves shifted behind him, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords, their masked faces unreadable. The villagers, still frozen in the square, had become a gallery of ghosts, witnesses to her execution. Kalia's mind raced. There was no escape, no explanation that would sound like anything but a lie. "I found him, I saved him, I loved him." The words would sound like ash in the face of his grief. He reached the threshold of her home. He had to duck his head to enter, his broad shoulders filling the entire doorway. The small cottage, her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. The air thickened, saturated with his scent of iron and cold rage. It was suffocating. He stopped a few feet from them. So close, she could feel the heat rolling off his body, see the intricate patterns on his leather armor, the way the scar over his eye pulled the skin tight. He was a monument to loss, carved from violence. His eyes fell to her hand, still resting on Rowan's arm. His lip curled in a silent, contemptuous snarl. He lifted his gaze to her face. "You will tell me your name," he said. It was not a request. Her throat was desert dry. "Kalia." The word was a faint tremor, barely audible. "Kalia, it might go," he repeated, tasting the name, turning it into an accusation. His eyes roamed over her face, her worn dress, her bare feet. He was cataloging her, a woman of no standing, no pack. An omega by her scent. Weak, unworthy. How had she managed to hide the heir to the throne for a decade? He took another step. Rowan moved. Faster than she could blink, he was between them. A silent, defiant shield. He raised the small wooden bird, his knuckles white, It wasn't a threat of violence. It was a statement. You will not touch her. The king stopped. He looked down at the boy, his son, who stood against him. A strange broken sound escaped his lips. It might have been a laugh, if he still remembered how. The sheer, impossible audacity of it. This wild, mute boy, challenging the Alpha King for a woman who had lied to them both. Darius's gaze softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at Rowan. He saw the echo of his mate's fire, her unbreakable spirit. Pride warred with a fresh wave of agony. This was what she had stolen from him. His son's first steps, his first hunt, his first act of defiance. Then his eyes lifted over Rowan's head and locked with Callia's once more. The softness vanished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He raised a hand slowly, deliberately. Callia flinched. Rowan tensed, a low growl finally rumbling in his chest, a sound so deep and primal it was shocking coming from his lean frame. But the king's hand did not go for Rowan. It moved past him. It reached for her. Her breath hitched. She was paralyzed, trapped in the amber of his focus. His fingers, calloused and hard from gripping a sword hilt, brushed against her cheek. The touch was surprisingly gentle, a ghost of a caress. It was also a claim, a brand. The world narrowed to that single point of contact. His skin against hers. His scent filled her senses, overwhelming the familiar smells of her home. She could feel the raw power thrumming just beneath his skin, a caged beast of grief and rage. He leaned in closer, his face just inches from hers. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were closed. He was breathing her in, scenting her, deeply. He was peeling back the layers of her life. The herbs she worked with, the wood smoke that clung to her clothes, the earth of her garden. He was searching for the lie, for the scent of conspiracy, of betrayal, but beneath it all, he found something else. The faint, clean scent of rain-washed stone and chamomile. And woven through it inextricably was Rowan's scent. Pine and moonbloom. They were a part of each other, their scents tangled together by a decade of shared life, shared meals, shared silence. His eyes snapped open. The cold fury was gone. In its place was a terrifying stillness, a void. He had found no lie in her scent, only the truth, which was somehow worse. She had not been part of a plot. She had simply taken him and loved him. She had given his son the life, the care that he, the king, could not. He dropped his hand as if her skin had burned him. He took a step back, putting a chasm of space between them. The air rushed into the void, cold and sharp. Callia's knees felt weak. She swayed, her hand flying to her cheek, where the ghost of his touch still tingled. The king turned his back on them. It was a gesture of supreme command, of dismissal. He faced the doorway, a dark silhouette against the bright, terrified day. "Miles," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. One of the black wolves materialized in the doorway, his head bowed. "Alpha. The boy is my pin, he is the heir." The guard did not react, but Callia felt the shockwave of those words ripple through the very air. The lost prince had been found. Here. In a forgotten hovel with a nameless Omega. "He is to be treated as such," Darius continued, his back still to them. "Prepare a carriage. He will ride with me." Callia's heart stopped. Ride with him? To the capital? To a life Rowan had never known? A life of duty and violence and a father who was a stranger made of ice and scars? "And the woman?" the guard asked, his voice a low rasp. The silence that followed was the most terrifying thing Callia had ever experienced. It was a silence filled with 1,000 possible deaths. Darius turned his head just enough to look at her over his shoulder. His eyes were black pits. There was no mercy in them, no forgiveness, only a chilling absolute possession. He was not just taking back his son. He was taking the woman who had hidden him. "She is evidence," the king said, the words falling like stones. "A part of my son's history. And she belongs to me now." He looked away, his attention already gone, moving on to the logistics of his new reality. He had found what he was looking for. Now he would take it, all of it. The guard, Miles, stepped into the room. He did not look at her with malice, but with a kind of detached pity. He gestured for her to move. Callia was frozen. She looked at Rowan. His face was a mask of confusion and fear. He looked from the guard to the king and then to her, his silver eyes asking a question he had no words for. What is happening? She had no answer. She had only the crushing weight of her own choices. She took a step and then another, moving toward the door, toward the end of her life as she knew it. Rowan moved with her, his shoulder brushing against hers, a silent promise that he would not leave her side. As she stepped out of the darkness of her cottage and into the unforgiving sunlight, she saw the villagers staring, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. She was no longer Kalia the herbalist. She was the woman who had hidden the king's heir, the Omega who had been claimed by the Alpha. Her life was no longer her own. It belonged to the ghost she had tried to save. The world became a cage of black leather and cold steel. They did not bind her. They did not need to. The king's presence was a chain more absolute than any iron. Kalia was placed in a covered carriage, a box of shadows and silence. The air was thick with the scent of the king's power, that storm of ozone and iron, and it was a constant, suffocating reminder of her new reality. Rowan was beside her. He sat stiffly, his back ramrod straight, his hands clenched into fists on his knees. He had refused to be separated from her, his silent defiance a force even the black wolves seemed hesitant to challenge. Darius had allowed it with a curt, dismissive nod, as if the boy's fierce loyalty to her was a curiosity, a problem to be solved later. The king himself did not ride with them. He rode at the head of the column, a dark, solitary figure on his black warhorse. But Kalia felt his awareness on her like a physical weight. He knew every breath she took, every frantic beat of her heart. The carriage lurched into motion. The rhythmic clopping of hooves and the creak of the wheels became the sound of her old life falling away. Through the small, barred window, she watched her cottage shrink, then disappear behind the trees. Her garden, her herbs, the quiet peace of the forest, all of it gone, swallowed by the past. Rowan's hand suddenly found hers. His fingers were cold, his grip tight, almost painful. He did not look at her. He stared straight ahead, his silver eyes fixed on the swaying back of the carriage door, as if he could see through it to the formidable man leading them away. His scent, usually a calm forest pine, was sharp with confusion and a low, simmering anger. He was a wolf cub cornered for the first time, and he did not know who to bite. Kalia squeezed his hand, a small, desperate gesture of reassurance she did not feel. What could she say? What could she explain? She had told him stories of the world beyond their woods, stories of kings and packs and wars. But she had never told him the one story that mattered, his own. She had protected him from the truth, and in doing so, she had left him defenseless against it. Hours bled into a gray, featureless afternoon. The rocking of the carriage was a constant, unsettling motion. No one spoke. The silence was a living thing, filled with the unspoken questions that hung between them. Rowan's anger slowly subsided, replaced by a deep, unnerving quiet. He was watching, listening, learning. The instincts of his bloodline were awakening, and she could feel the shift in him, the subtle sharpening of his senses. Late in the day, the procession stopped. The carriage door opened, flooding the dim space with the cool, fading light of dusk. The guard, Miles, stood there, his masked face impassive. "The king requires your presence," he said, his voice a low gravel. His gaze was directed at her, not Rowan, her. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. Rowan's grip on her hand tightened possessively. A low growl, barely audible, vibrated in his chest. Miles didn't flinch. His attention remained on Kalia. Alone. The word was a command, absolute. Rowan's growl deepened, his lips pulling back from his teeth in a silent snarl. It was the first time she had ever seen him so overtly aggressive toward anyone. The prince inside the wild boy was rising to the surface. Before the situation could escalate, Kalia gently pulled her hand free from his. She gave him a look, one she had used 1,000 times before. "Trust me, it's all right." His silver eyes were filled with doubt, with a fierce protective fire. But a decade of her care had forged a bond deeper than his new, raw instincts. He subsided, his snarl fading into a tense, watchful silence. He did not like it, but he obeyed. She stepped out of the carriage. The air was cold, smelling of damp earth and pine. They had made camp in a small clearing, the light of several fires pushing back the encroaching shadows of the forest. The black wolves moved with silent efficiency, setting up tents, tending to the horses. It was a military camp, stark and intimidating, and in the center of it all, by the largest fire, stood the king. He had removed his heavy armor. He stood in a simple black tunic and breeches, the firelight catching the silver threads in his dark hair. The scar over his eye seemed deeper, darker in the flickering light. He was staring into the flames, his back to her, but she knew the moment he sensed her approach. His shoulders tensed, the muscles across his back shifting like tectonic plates. Miles escorted her to the edge of the firelight and then melted back into the shadows, leaving her utterly alone with the Alpha King. She stopped a respectful distance away, her hands clasped before her, her head bowed. The Omega instinct was strong, a primal urge to show submission in the face of such overwhelming power. For a long time he said nothing. He just stared into the fire, as if searching for answers in the dancing flames. The only sounds were the crackle of burning wood and the distant stamp of a horse. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, rough with an emotion she couldn't name. Did he ever ask about them? The question was so unexpected, it took her a moment to understand. Them, his pack, his mate, Rowan's mother, her throat tightened. He doesn't speak. I know he does not speak, Darius growled, turning on her with a sudden, violent motion. His eyes were burning embers in the darkness. But did he ask, with his hands, with his eyes? Did he ever wonder why he was alone with you? The accusation in that last word was a physical blow. She flinched. Sometimes, she whispered, her voice trembling, when he was younger, he would point at the moon, then at me, then he would make a space beside me, an empty space, and look at me, as if asking, oh, who was supposed to be there? The king's face contorted, a mask of raw, visceral pain. He took a step toward her, his shadow falling over her, swallowing her whole. And what did you tell my son, who has no words, when he asked you where his mother was? He snarled, his voice a blade of ice and grief. I told him she was a part of the moon now, Kalia confessed, tears welling in her eyes. That she watched over him every night. That her light was his light. Silence. The fury in his eyes flickered, replaced by something shattered. He looked away, back toward the fire, his jaw working. He had spent a decade hunting his son's kidnapper, imagining a monster, a conspirator, a creature of greed and malice. He had not imagined this. A quiet woman who had given his son the moon for a mother. He has the gift, Darius said, his voice flat now, hollowed out. The Velkin sight. He sees things, hears things others cannot. The whispers of the trees, the memories in the stones. Did you know? She shook her head, confused. He was always connected to the forest. He knew where the deer would pass an hour before they came. He knew when a storm was coming long before the clouds gathered. It is not the forest, the king said, a bitter edge to his tone. It is the blood, our blood. It remembers. It is a curse as much as a gift. He finally looked at her again, his eyes clear and cold as a winter sky. He should have been trained, shielded. What you saw as a connection to nature, others would see as madness. He would have been cast out, or killed. The unspoken truth hung in the air between them. By hiding him, by raising him in isolation, she may have inadvertently saved his life a second time. A flicker of something that was not hatred crossed his face. It wasn't gratitude. It was a grudging, painful acknowledgement. Why? He asked, the single word carrying the weight of 1,000 questions. Why did you take him? Here it was, the moment of her judgment. I was scavenging the ruins, she began, her voice gaining a small measure of strength. She had to make him understand. Days after the fire, I heard something, a whimper. He was... Her voice broke. She took a shaky breath. He was so small. His fur was matted with blood. His mother... She was beside him. She had shielded him with her body. Darius's eyes closed. His hand went to his chest, over his heart. A gesture of pure, instinctual pain. I saw the silver in his eyes, Kalia continued. The memory as clear as yesterday. I knew what he was, who he was. I knew the danger, but I could not leave him there to die. My own... I had just lost a child, a babe, born sleeping. The confession was ripped from her, a secret she had never spoken aloud. My arms were empty, my heart was broken, and he was there, alone. I was selfish. It was a selfish, desperate act. I took him, I ran, and I never looked back. She finished, her chest heaving, the truth laid bare at his feet. She waited for the condemnation, for the sentence. The king was utterly still. The firelight carved deep shadows into his face, making him look ancient, a creature of myth and sorrow. He did not look at her. He was looking past her, toward the carriage where his son sat waiting. He was seeing the last 10 years not as a void, but as a life he had missed. A life this woman, this broken Omega, had given his heir. A life of quiet woods and a mother who was the moon. "You will eat," he said abruptly, his tone clipped, devoid of all feeling. He turned his back on her completely. "You will rest. Tomorrow we ride for the capital." It was not forgiveness. It was a stay of execution. "And Kalia," he added, without looking at her. His voice was a low warning, a promise of what was to come. "When we arrive, you will tell my council this story, every word of it. They will not be as understanding as I am." The threat was clear. Her fate was not in his hands alone. It was in the hands of a pack that had lost its prince, a pack that would be hungry for justice. And he would let them decide what to do with the woman who stole their future. The capital was a fortress of jagged stone and resentful silence. It rose from the snow-dusted plains like a crown of thorns, its towers piercing a sky the color of old iron. There were no banners, no welcoming crowds. The city of Silverwood felt like a tomb, a monument to a massacre that had happened a decade ago, yet felt as raw as an open wound. The air itself was heavy with grief. As their procession passed through the massive gates, Kalia felt hundreds of eyes upon them, not with curiosity, but with a cold, simmering suspicion. Whispers followed their carriage like starving wolves. "The king has returned. He brings a boy and a woman." They saw Rowan first. The carriage door was open now, a silent command from the king. They saw the boy with the wild hair and the unmistakable silver eyes. A gasp rippled through the onlookers. A ghost had returned. Their lost prince was alive. Then they saw her. The whispers turned venomous. "Who is she? An Omega? Look at her clothes. A commoner, a kidnapper, a witch." Kalia's hands trembled in her lap. She kept her eyes down, her focus on the worn fabric of her dress. But she could feel their hatred like a physical force. She was the stranger, the outsider who had stolen their hope and kept it hidden for 10 years. Rowan felt it too. He sat straighter, his jaw tight, his hand resting near the hilt of a small dagger Miles had given him. He wasn't afraid. He was territorial. A low, protective energy radiated from him, a silent warning to the watching crowd. He had claimed her as his, and the awakening alpha in his blood would not tolerate a challenge. The carriage finally stopped in the central courtyard of the citadel. It was a vast, empty space, surrounded by towering walls of dark granite. The wind howled through the battlements, a lonely, mournful sound. King Darius dismounted, his movements sharp and commanding. He did not wait for them. He strode toward the great hall, his black cloak billowing behind him like the wings of a crow. The heavy doors boomed shut behind him, leaving them alone in the courtyard with his guards. "Come," Miles said, his voice softer than usual. He opened the carriage door for them. Kalia's legs felt unsteady as she stepped onto the cold paving stones. She looked up at the citadel, at the unblinking stone faces carved into the walls, at the slit-like windows that seemed to watch her with contempt. This was not a home, it was a prison. Miles led them not toward the great hall, but to a smaller, more secluded tower at the edge of the courtyard. The guards at the door bowed their heads as they passed, but their eyes were hard, their scents thick with distrust. The rooms they were given were luxurious beyond anything Kalia had ever imagined. A fire roared in a massive hearth, thick furs were draped over a soft bed, and a table was laden with food. It was a gilded cage. "You will remain here," Miles instructed, his gaze lingering on Rowan for a moment with a strange mixture of awe and concern. "The king will summon you when the council is assembled." He turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. He looked at Kalia, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something other than duty in his eyes. Pity, perhaps. Be careful what you say, Omega. Their grief has sharp teeth. The door closed with a heavy thud, the sound of the lock clicking into place echoing the shutting of a cell door. They were alone. Rowan immediately began to pace the room, his movements restless, wolf-like. He ran his hands over the tapestries, touched the cold glass of the window, his senses overwhelmed. He had spent his life in a world of wood and earth and skin. This world of stone and smoke and sorrow was alien to him. He stopped at the window, which overlooked the city. He stared down at the people, at the guards, at the rigid, ordered life of the capital. His shoulders were tense, his hands clenched. He looked trapped. Kalia went to him, her heart aching. She placed a hand on his back. "Rowan!" He turned to her, his silver eyes wide, frantic. He gestured at the room, at the city below, a question clear on his face. "What is this place?" This was your father's home," she said softly. "Your home." He recoiled as if she had struck him. He shook his head, a sharp, violent motion. He pointed to his own chest, then at her. He made a small circle with his hands, a gesture he had used since he was a small child. "Our home." Then he swept his hand toward the window, at the cold, gray world outside, and sliced his hand through the air. Not this. Tears stung her eyes. She had done this. She had raised him in a lie. A beautiful, peaceful lie. And now the truth was a cage he could not understand. A sharp knock on the door made them both jump. It was not Miles. It was a different guard, his face a grim mask. "The council is ready, the king awaits." The walk to the great hall was the longest of Kalia's life. The stone corridors were cold and silent, lined with ancient portraits of Velkan alphas, their silver eyes seeming to follow her, to judge her. The great hall was a cavern of shadows and echoes. A massive circular chamber, its walls lined with black banners that bore the crest of the Silver Moon Pack. A howling wolf before a shattered moon. At the far end of the hall, on a throne carved from a single piece of obsidian, sat King Darius. He was no longer just a father or a man. He was the Alpha King, a figure of immense, terrifying power. Arranged in a semicircle before him were the members of his council, 6 of them. Old wolves, their faces etched with the memory of loss, their sense a potent mix of power, grief, and suspicion. They were the elders, the warriors, the heart of the pack that had been decimated. Kalia was led to the center of the room. Rowan was forced to stand by the entrance with the guards, a silent, furious spectator. She stood alone on the cold stone floor, the focus of all their pain, all their anger. "This is the woman," Darius said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "She calls herself Kalia. She is the one who found my son." He did not say saved, he said found. The choice of word was deliberate. A knife's edge. An old wolf, his face a roadmap of scars, his hair white as snow, rose to his feet. He was the eldest, his scent carrying the weight of authority. "You have been in the presence of our prince for 10 years. You knew who he was, and you said nothing. It was not a question, it was a verdict." Kalia's voice was a whisper. "I feared for him, the ones who attacked your pack. I thought they might still be looking for him." A hollow, mirthless laugh came from another council member, a woman with eyes as hard as flint. "You feared for him? Or you coveted him? An Omega, barren and alone. A prince falls into your lap. A convenient miracle, is it not?" The words struck her, stealing her breath. She had confessed the loss of her own child to the king. Had he told them? Was he using her own grief as a weapon against her? She risked a glance at the throne. Darius's face was unreadable, a mask of cold indifference. He would not help her. He was testing her, judging her. "It was not like that," she insisted, her voice trembling but finding a sliver of strength. "I loved him. I raised him as my own." "You raised him as a commoner," the old wolf boomed, his voice cracking with fury. "He does not know our laws, our history. He does not even know his own name. What name did you give him, woman?" "Rowan," she whispered. The name fell into the silence, an alien sound. "Rowan," the king repeated from his throne, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. "His name is Lycan, the name of my father, the name of his grandfather, a name you stole from him." Each word was a stone, building a wall around her, burying her. She looked desperately toward the entrance. Rowan was straining against the guards, a low growl tearing from his throat. He could feel her distress, her fear. He was fighting to get to her. The old wolf stepped closer. He circled her like a predator, his eyes narrowed, his nostrils flaring as he scented her. "She smells of deception," he snarled. "And something else. Something weak. She is wolfless." A collective gasp went through the council. Wolfless. An omega without an inner wolf. The lowest of the low. A broken creature. Kalia flinched. It was her deepest shame, the reason she had lived at the edge of the village, an outcast. She had been born this way, incomplete. The heir to the Silver Moon pack, the flint-eyed woman spat with disgust, was raised by a barren, wolfless omega. It is an insult to the memory of our Luna. The woman must be punished, another elder declared. She has weakened the royal line with her common touch. She has contaminated the prince. The calls for her blood rose, a chorus of grief-fueled rage. They needed someone to blame, and she was the perfect sacrifice. Kalia's world began to spin. This was it. This was her end. She closed her eyes, bracing for the final judgment. A sudden shattering roar silenced the entire hall. It was not a word. It was pure primal rage. A sound of breaking chains and unleashed fury. Rowan! He had thrown off the guards. 2 of the king's elite black wolves, sending them staggering back as if they were children. He was stalking into the center of the hall, his body radiating a power that was terrifying in its intensity. The air crackled around him. His silver eyes were no longer just bright. They were glowing, burning with an inner light, the raw, untamed magic of his bloodline unleashed. He was not Lycan, the lost prince. He was Rowan, the boy from the woods, and his entire world was being threatened. He came to a stop, not beside her, but in front of her. He faced the council, his feet planted, his body a living shield. He did not snarl, he did not growl. He simply stared at them, his glowing eyes a promise of death. The elders, who had been calling for her blood just moments before, took an involuntary step back. They were looking at the raw, untamed spirit of the Velkin line. It was the face of the Alpha King in his youth, the face of their Luna in her defiance. It was their past and their future, embodied in a silent, furious boy who had just claimed a wolfless omega as his pack. The hall was utterly silent, save for Rowan's heavy breathing. Then from the throne, a single soft sound. A quiet scrape of stone on stone. Darius had stood up. He descended the steps of his throne, his movements slow, deliberate. He did not look at his council. He did not look at Kalia. His entire being was focused on his son. He saw the raw power, the protective instinct, the unbreakable loyalty. He saw everything he had thought was lost forever, everything this woman had nurtured in the boy. He stopped directly in front of Rowan, father and son, alpha and heir, face to face. The tension in the room was so thick it was hard to breathe. Darius reached out slowly, his hand open, palm up. A gesture of peace, an offering. He did not touch his son. His hand went past him. His fingers brushed against Kalia's arm. The touch was light, a ghost of a sensation, but it was a declaration, an anchor in the storm. He drew her forward, pulling her from behind Rowan's protective stance until she stood beside him, between the king and his heir. He kept his hand on her arm, his thumb stroking the soft skin of her wrist, a possessive, claiming touch for all to see. He looked at his son, then at his stunned council. His voice when he spoke was quiet, yet it held the unshakable weight of command. "She is not his past," the Alpha King declared, his eyes locking with Kalia's, a silent vow passing between them. "She is his pack." He looked at the council, his gaze sweeping over them, a silent dare for any to challenge him. "And she is under my protection." Protection was a cage gilded with the king's scent. Darius's declaration in the Great Hall was not an act of mercy, it was an act of possession. Kalia was no longer a prisoner awaiting sentence. She was the king's ward, a status that was somehow more precarious. She was moved from the tower to a suite of rooms adjoining the king's own, a place of suffocating luxury and constant surveillance. She was watched, not by guards, but by the king himself. His presence was a constant hum beneath the surface of her new life. She would catch his scent in the corridor, a hint of iron and winter pine. She would feel his gaze on her from across the training grounds as she watched Rowan, now reluctantly called Lycan by the tutors, learn the art of the sword. He never spoke to her, not directly. He would issue orders through Miles, but he observed her, studied her, with an intensity that stripped her bare. He watched the way Lycan's eyes always sought her out, the way the boy's shoulders would relax only when she was near. He watched the silent language that passed between them, a glance, a small gesture, a shared breath. He was watching a bond he could not comprehend, and it was eating him alive. The council, though silenced by their alpha's decree, made their displeasure known in 1,000 subtle ways. Servants would ignore her. Tutors would speak down to her. The elders would look through her as if she were a ghost, their sense thick with contempt. They called her the Omega, never by her name. She was a stain on their royal house, a reminder of the wild, common world that had contaminated their prince. Lycan felt their scorn, and it fueled his own silent rebellion. He was a terrible student. He fought the swordmasters with a wild, unpredictable ferocity that was more forest predator than trained warrior. He ignored the tutors who tried to teach him history and law, choosing instead to sit by the window, carving intricate animals from scraps of wood, his silver eyes distant and longing for the trees. The only person he truly responded to was Darius. Their interactions were fraught with a tense, unspoken gravity. The king began to train his son personally, taking him to the sparring yards at dawn. Kalia would watch from her window, her heart a knot of fear and a strange, painful hope. There were no words between them, only the clash of steel, the grunt of exertion, the slap of leather on leather. Darius was a brutal, relentless teacher, pushing Lycan to his limits, forcing the prince to emerge from the quiet boy. And Lycan met his father's harshness with a stubborn, unyielding resilience. In those moments, Kalia saw the truth of them. They were the same soul, fractured by the same tragedy, two halves of a broken whole, trying to piece themselves together through violence because they had forgotten the language of love. One evening, a servant brought Kalia a summons. The king required her presence in the royal library. Her pulse stumbled. It was the first time since their arrival that he had asked for her directly. She found him standing before a towering wall of scrolls, a single candle casting his long shadow across the floor. He did not turn as she entered. "He is not learning," Darius said, his voice a low rumble. "His mind is still in your forest." "He has never been surrounded by walls," Kalia replied softly. "He needs time." "We do not have time," Darius countered, finally turning to face her. His eyes were dark, haunted. "There are whispers from the northern territories. The packs that shattered after the massacre are stirring again. They are leaderless, desperate. They are drawn to rumors of a returned heir." He took a step closer. The air grew heavy, charged with his proximity. "They will see his silence as weakness," he said, his voice dropping lower. "They will see his bond with you as a flaw. They will challenge him. They will challenge me." Kalia understood. Lycan's untamed nature, his refusal to conform, his devotion to a wolfless Omega. It was all a threat to his father's reign, a reign built on the image of unshakable, ruthless strength. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her then, a long, searching look that seemed to peel back every layer of her soul. He saw not the Omega, not the kidnapper, but the woman who had succeeded where he had failed. The woman who had kept his son's heart safe. "I want you to teach him," he said, the words sounding as if they were torn from him. "Not the sword, not history. Teach him what you taught him in the woods." "I taught him how to be—" "Rowan," she said, confused. "No," Darius corrected, taking another step until he was standing directly before her, close enough for her to feel the heat from his body. "You taught him how to be whole. You taught him how to feel. I have forgotten how." The confession was a crack in his armor, a glimpse of the broken man beneath the crown. His scent, usually so controlled, was laced with the raw fragrance of grief and a profound, aching loneliness. Instinct, pure and unbidden, made her lift her hand. She reached out, her fingers hesitating for a moment before they gently touched the jagged scar that cut through his eyebrow. It was a gesture of impossible intimacy. He flinched, his whole body going rigid. No one had touched his face, his scar, in 10 years. But he did not pull away. He stood utterly still, his dark eyes wide, vulnerable for the first time. Her thumb traced the raised line of healed flesh. "This is a part of you," she whispered. "But it is not all of you. You are not just a king of scars." Something shifted in his eyes. A storm of emotions too vast to name. He leaned into her touch. Just for a second, a silent surrender. The weight of his crown, of his grief, seemed to lift. And he was just a man, scarred and searching for a way back to himself. His hand came up, covering hers where it rested on his face. His skin was rough, calloused, but his grip was gentle. He held her there, their hands covering the mark of his greatest pain. The air between them thrummed, thick with a connection that had nothing to do with kings and omegas, and everything to do with two broken souls recognizing their own reflection. A sudden sharp howl from outside shattered the moment. It was not the howl of a common wolf. It was a cry of challenge, a cry of war. Darius dropped his hand, dropping hers with it. The king was back, the vulnerability vanishing behind a mask of cold fury. He strode to the balcony, Kalia following a step behind him. The courtyard below was filled with wolves. Not his black wolves, but a ragged, motley pack of shifters from the northern wastes. They were gaunt, scarred, their eyes burning with a wild, desperate light. At their head stood a massive brute of an alpha, his fur the color of dried blood, a cruel sneer on his face. "Darius Velkin," the blood alpha roared, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "We have heard the rumors. You parade a silent boy and claim he is the heir. We say he is a fraud, a puppet you used to cling to your broken throne." Kalia felt Lycan's presence before she saw him. He appeared on the balcony beside them, drawn by the challenge. He wore no armor, only a simple tunic, but his silver eyes blazed with a cold fire that mirrored his father's. Darius placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a silent command to stay put. He looked down at the challenger, his face a mask of contempt. "You dare howl at my gates, Kaelin?" Darius's voice was deceptively calm, yet it carried across the courtyard, silencing the muttering of the northern pack. "You who ran like a coward the night my pack burned? You have no right to question my bloodline." "Your bloodline ended that night," Kaelin snarled, emboldened by the king's stillness. "That boy is nothing. He has the scent of a commoner on him, the stink of a wolfless omega." He spat on the ground. "I challenge the boy, trial by combat. If he is truly of your line, let him prove it. If he wins, we will follow. If he loses, Silverwood will have a new king." The world stopped. A trial by combat. Against Kaelin, a scarred, seasoned killer. Lycan had been training for weeks, not years. He was not ready. It was a death sentence. "I do not permit a whelp like you to make demands in my home," Darius growled, his own power beginning to radiate from him, a palpable pressure in the air. "Then you are a coward." Kaelin laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Hiding behind your son's silence because you know he is not fit. He is weak, broken, tainted by the pet you keep in your chambers." Something inside Lycan snapped. Before Darius could stop him, before Kalia could even cry out, he vaulted over the balcony railing. He landed on the stones of the courtyard below with a grace that was all predator, a 20-foot drop that should have broken his bones. He rose to his full height, his body taut with a fury that seemed to make him bigger, more substantial. He pointed one finger at Kaelin. Then he drew his thumb across his own throat. A silent, brutal acceptance of the challenge. A roar of approval went up from the northern pack. The council elders, who had gathered on the battlements, looked on with grim satisfaction. The Omega's pet would finally be put down, and the question of the succession would be answered in blood. Darius stood frozen on the balcony, his face a mask of horror. His son, his newly found son, was about to be slaughtered because of a taunt, because of a challenge he could not, in his pride, refuse. Kalia gripped the stone railing, her knuckles white. She looked from the terrified father to the defiant son. Lycan was not just fighting for his right to the throne. He was fighting for her, for the woman they had called a pet, for the home they had made in the woods. The king's past had come howling at his gate, and it had come to claim the one thing he had left to lose. The courtyard became a circle of bloodlust and cold stone. 2 circles were drawn in the dirt with sacred ash. One for the prince, one for the challenger. Tradition demanded that the king, as reigning alpha, preside over the trial. Darius descended from the balcony, his movements stiff, his face carved from granite. Every step was an agony. He was walking his son to his own execution. Kalia remained on the balcony, a helpless observer. Her heart was a frantic drum, her breath catching in her throat with every move below. She could feel the bloodlust rolling off the northern pack, a thick, suffocating wave of hunger for violence. His own council watched with cold, assessing eyes, waiting to see if their prince was worthy of the name Velkin, or if he was merely the Omega's stray. Lycan stood in his circle, stripped to the waist. His lean, wiry strength seemed boyish, inadequate against Kaelin's brute mass. The challenger was a mountain of scarred muscle and snarling contempt, flexing his hands, eager for the kill. Miles handed Lycan a sword. It was a Velkin blade, slender and sharp, but it looked heavy and awkward in his hand. He had trained with it, yes, but he was not a swordsman. He was a creature of the forest, of silence and instinct. Darius stood between them, his face a mask. "The laws are absolute," he declared, his voice a dead thing in the cold air. "The fight is to submission or death. Let the moon bear witness." He looked at his son, one last long look, and in his eyes Kalia saw a father's desperate, silent plea, "Survive." Then he stepped back. Kaelin roared and charged. He didn't bother with finesse. He came in like a battering ram, his heavy broadsword swinging in a vicious arc, meant to cleave Lycan in two. Lycan did not meet the charge. He moved. He flowed to the side, impossibly fast. The years of silent movement in the forest now his only defense. The broadsword smashed into the ground where he had been standing, sending sparks flying. Lycan didn't counterattack. He retreated, his eyes, those brilliant silver pools, fixed on his opponent. He was watching, learning. His breathing was even, his body relaxed, a stark contrast to Kaelin's frothing rage. The crowd jeered. "Coward, fight him!" But Kalia saw what they didn't. Lycan wasn't running. He was hunting. He was using the circle as his territory, drawing Kaelin deeper into his own world of silent calculation. Kaelin was a warrior of the battlefield, used to formations and brute strength. Lycan was a predator of the deep woods, used to patience and the single perfect strike. Again and again Kaelin charged. Again and again Lycan evaded, sometimes by a hair's breadth. A thin red line appeared on his ribs, where the tip of the broadsword had grazed him. The scent of his blood, royal blood, hit the air, and the northern pack grew more frantic. Kalia's hands flew to her mouth. He was bleeding, he was tiring. He could not keep this up forever. "He is playing with him," one of the council elders spat from the battlements. "He has no killer instinct. The Omega made him soft." Darius stood like a statue, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. He was bound by law, forced to watch, unable to intervene. Kaelin, enraged by Lycan's evasiveness, finally overextended. He lunged, a clumsy, furious stab, and for a split second, his side was exposed. Now, Lycan moved. He dropped his sword. The crowd gasped. Disarming yourself was suicide. But Lycan didn't need the sword. It was an alien thing in his hand. He moved inside Kaelin's guard, his body a blur. He slammed the heel of his palm into Kaelin's elbow, the sickening crunch of bone echoing in the courtyard. The broadsword clattered to the ground. In the same motion, Lycan grabbed the dagger from his own belt, the small familiar blade he had used for carving, and drove it deep into the muscle of Kaelin's thigh. Kaelin bellowed in pain and rage, swatting at Lycan like a bear at a wasp. He knocked the boy back, but the damage was done. His sword arm was useless, his leg buckling. The fight had changed. Lycan didn't press the attack. He retreated to the center of the circle, his silver eyes glowing with a cold, feral light. He was breathing heavily now, the cut on his side weeping blood, but his stance was steady. He had wounded the beast. Now he would wait for it to bleed. The tactic was pure wolf. Isolate, wound, weaken, endure. It was the way Kalia had seen him hunt in the Whisperwood. It was a strategy born not of training manuals, but of pure, unadulterated instinct. Enraged and bleeding, Kaelin shifted. With a sound of tearing flesh and cracking bone, he exploded into his wolf form. A monstrous creature of red fur and yellow fangs, twice the size of a normal wolf. His injured leg dragged, his right arm hung limp at his side in its transformed state, but he was still a terrifying force. He lunged, jaws snapping, aiming to tear out Lycan's throat. The law of the trial was clear. A shifter could use their wolf form. The boy, if he had a wolf, would have to shift to meet him, but Kalia knew. He had never shifted. He had grown up in isolation, without a pack to guide him through the first change. It was a violent, agonizing process. To attempt it now, under attack, would kill him. Darius took a step forward, his own body thrumming with the urge to shift, to protect his son, to tear Kaelin apart. But the law held him. If he interfered, he would forfeit the throne. His entire kingdom would fall into chaos. Lycan stood his ground. He did not try to shift. He watched the massive red wolf bear down on him, and a strange calm settled over his features. He closed his eyes. He took a deep breath, and he did something no one expected. He howled. It was not the howl of a wolf. It was his own voice, wordless and raw, a sound torn from the deepest part of his silent soul. It was a cry filled with a decade of loneliness, of confusion, of fierce protective love for the woman watching from the balcony. It was the sound of the forest, of the wind through the pines, of the wild, untamed heart she had nurtured. The sound struck the charging wolf like a physical blow. Kaelin faltered, his ears flattening, his charge slowing. Then, an impossible thing happened. The wind answered. It whipped through the courtyard, a sudden violent gale that seemed to come from nowhere. It tore at the banners, kicked up dust and ash, and shrieked through the battlements. It was a cold, wild wind, smelling of pine and distant snow and something ancient. And it was on his side. The wind swirled around Lycan, a protective vortex. It blinded Kaelin with dust, pushed against his charge, its howl mingling with Lycan's own. Lycan opened his eyes. They were no longer silver. They were blazing white. Two orbs of pure, unadulterated power. The Velkin gift, the curse. He wasn't just connected to the forest. He was connected to the very elements. He could speak to the wind. He let out another howl, and this time it was a command. The wind tore a loose shutter from a high window and sent it spinning down like a blade. It struck Kaelin in his wounded leg, and the massive wolf collapsed with a yelp of pain. Before he could rise, Lycan was on him. He moved with a speed that was no longer human. He held the small carving dagger in his hand, and he did not stab, he did not kill. He pressed the tip of the blade to the thick fur of Kaelin's throat. A single drop of blood welled up around the point. Submission. The courtyard was dead silent, save for the dying wind. Lycan stood over the defeated Alpha, his chest heaving, his eyes slowly fading back to their normal silver. He looked from Kaelin to the stunned northern pack, to the shocked faces of the council. Then he lifted his head and looked at Kalia. He raised the bloodied dagger, a declaration of his victory. A victory he had won not with their swords or their laws, but with the wildness she had preserved in him. And then he spoke. His first word. His voice was rough, unused, a stranger in his own throat, but it was clear. It carried across the silence, a name that was not Lycan, not Rowan, but something new, something he had chosen for himself. Kalia. It was a vow, a claim, a statement to the entire world. He was not just the king's son, he was hers. Darius stared at his son, his face a mixture of awe, relief, and a profound, shattering understanding. The boy had not just won a fight. He had claimed his own identity. He had found his voice to speak the name of his pack. He turned his head and looked up at the balcony, his gaze finding Kalia's. The coldness was gone from his eyes. In its place was a grudging respect, and something more, something that looked terrifyingly like hope. He had tried to force his son to become a prince, a copy of himself, but Kalia had raised him to be a king, a new kind of king, one who could speak to the wind, one who remembered how to choose his own name. 1 year later, the air in Silverwood no longer tasted of grief. It tasted of wood smoke and baking bread, of melting snow and the first promises of spring. The silence of the great halls had been replaced by the murmur of a court slowly remembering how to live, how to hope. And in the training yard, the clash of steel had become a conversation, not a conflict. Kalia watched from the gardens, her hands tending to a small, thriving patch of moonbloom she had planted herself. The white flowers, glowing faintly in the twilight, were a piece of her old life woven into the new, a scent of home. In the yard below, Darius and Lycan moved in a blur of deadly grace. They sparred with blunted blades, a father and son forging a bond in the only language they had first shared, combat. But the anger was gone. It had been replaced by respect. Lycan was taller now, his frame filling out with the strength of a young alpha, but he still moved with the unpredictable flow of the forest. He fought not just with the sword, but with the wind at his back, a silent partner in the dance. He was a prince of two worlds, the wild and the stone, and for the first time, he seemed at peace with both. The council now called her Lady Kalia. The name still felt like a borrowed dress, but their scorn had faded into a grudging acceptance. Lycan's victory, his impossible power, and the king's unwavering protection had silenced their whispers. They saw now that her softness had not been a weakness in their prince. It had been his shield. The sparring ended. Darius clapped a hand on Lycan's shoulder, a gesture of pride that was still new, still a little clumsy, but deeply felt. Lycan grinned, a rare, breathtaking flash of the boy she had raised, and said something that made his father laugh, a real laugh. A sound that had been absent from the citadel for more than a decade. It was a sound that healed the very stones. Lycan's silver eyes found hers across the garden. He lifted a hand in farewell before heading toward the mess hall, leaving her alone with the coming night, and with the king. Darius did not follow his son. Instead, he began the slow walk up the stone steps toward her garden, toward her. Her heart didn't pound with fear anymore. It beat with a slow, steady rhythm, a quiet anticipation that was both thrilling and terrifying. He had kept his word. She was protected, respected, but a chasm of unspoken things still lay between them, a space defined by his grief and her secrets. He stopped a few feet away. The silence between them was different now. It was not empty. It was full, waiting. "He is becoming a fine warrior," Darius said, his voice a low rumble that settled deep in her chest. "He is becoming a good man," she replied softly. Darius's gaze fell to the moonbloom, their scent sweet in the cool air. This was her favorite, he said, his voice thick with memory, but the sharp edges of his pain had been worn smooth by time. She would have loved him, and she would have been grateful to you. It was the closest he had ever come to saying thank you. It was more than enough. "I miss him sometimes," Kalia confessed, her own secret grief. "The quiet boy from the woods." "He is still there," Darius assured her. "He just has more names now." He looked at her, his dark eyes intense under the rising moon. "He told me what you called him, Rowan." He said the name without the poison it had once held. "It is a good name, for a boy raised by the forest." "He says they are both his name," she whispered. "Lycan for his father, Rowan for his home." "And you, Kalia," Darius said, taking a step closer. "What is your home?" The question hung in the air between them. Was it the cottage that was now just a memory? Or this gilded cage that had slowly, impossibly begun to feel like a sanctuary? She had no answer. He reached for her, not with command, but with a question in his touch. His hand was warm, his calloused fingers gently cupping her jaw. His thumb brushed across her cheek, a gesture that echoed the first time he had touched her, in that small, terrified moment in her cottage. But the fury was gone. The accusation was gone. In its place was a raw, aching tenderness. "I was a king of ghosts," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I spent 10 years hunting for the last piece of my past. But you were not my past. You were the keeper of my future." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. His scent enveloped her, iron and pine, but softened now with something else. Something that was just him, just Darius. He was no longer the Alpha King. He was a man who had finally stopped chasing ghosts. "I claimed you as pact to protect you from my council," he confessed, his breath a warm ghost against her lips. "It was a political move, a lie." Her heart faltered. "The lie," he continued, his thumb tracing the line of her lips, "is that it is no longer a lie." He lifted his other hand and gently touched the scar above his eye, the mark of his pain, his loss. "My son showed me that my wounds did not have to be my identity. And you You showed me they did not have to be a wall. This is a part of me, he whispered, repeating her own words back to her. But it is not all of me. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of relief, of a joy so profound it hurt. Kalia, he breathed her name like a prayer. I am not asking you to be a lady of my court. I am not asking you to be my ward. I am asking you to be my Luna. To be my home. She didn't need words. She leaned in and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was not one of fire and passion, but of deep, soul-shattering recognition. It was the taste of forgiveness, the feel of coming home. It was the closing of a circle, the healing of a decade-old wound. When they parted, a shadow fell over them. Lycan stood at the edge of the garden, a small, knowing smile on his face. He said nothing. He simply came and stood beside them, a silent, solid presence. One hand found his father's arm. The other briefly squeezed Kalia's. The three of them stood there for a long time, bathed in the light of the full moon, the Alpha King who had learned to feel again, the wolfless Omega who had become the heart of a pack, and the silent prince who had found his voice to unite them. The broken throne had found its heart, and under the silver gaze of the moon, three wolves finally came home.